St. Pope John Paul II wrote in Catechesi Tradendae, catechesis is intrinsically linked with the whole of liturgical and sacramental activity. For it is in the sacraments, especially in the Eucharist, that Christ Jesus works in fullness for the transformation of human beings. Authentic practice of the sacraments is bound to have a catechetical aspect. In other words, sacramental life is impoverished and very soon turns to hollow ritualism if it is not based on serious knowledge of the meaning of the sacraments. The catechesis becomes intellectualized if it fails to come alive in the sacramental practice. So there's the grace that is received in Mass, which helps sustain the student, but also helps to sustain the Catholic school and its Catholic identity. But what is the educational component to celebrating Mass and other liturgies within the Catholic school community, and how is being present at the Church's sacred liturgy a part of catechesis?
We know from our Catholic tradition that with the power of symbol, that we teach more powerfully through symbols than with words. Both are necessary, of course. So when a Mass is celebrated reverently and beautifully, as the Masses we have celebrated here at the Sacra Liturgia Conference, that is already a powerful catechesis about the beauty of God and about the devotion that we owe to God. And it inspires, I think it inspires people to make God more at the center of their life. So I think a worthy, reverent, solemn, and beautiful celebration of the liturgy in that way is in and of itself a catechesis, because we learn in all kinds of ways, not just by verbal communication, but by all kinds of nonverbal communication as well. So the art and the architecture of the church, the music, the solemn, beautiful music, the vestments, the incense, all of this is a powerful way of communicating the beauty of God and who we are before God. So that in and of itself is already a part of the catechesis. The verbal catechesis has to help our people understand that and appreciate beauty. People need to be educated to appreciate beauty. And so we sort of prepare the ground to make it fertile, so that at the liturgy, when the seeds are planted, they can take root, and then they can blossom in the lives of our people and lives of holiness and good works.
Okay, very good. In that quote that I just read, St. John Paul II includes the word authentic when he describes the educational benefits of the authentic practice of the sacraments. In my lifetime, I've heard about and witnessed a number of innovations to the Mass, to the liturgy, introduced by priests who genuinely want to make the Mass more interesting to young people. And in the music, at the sign of peace, in the homily, and even in the prayers at Mass. But even where Mass is celebrated according to the liturgical norms, there seems to be often a minimalist approach to the Mass, even in most parishes, so much that young people might never experience the richness that the Church's sacred liturgies can offer. So my question is, how important is it for Catholic schools to not only offer sacred liturgy in accord with the norms and the practices of the Church, but also with the music and the ceremonies that are associated with the Church's most solemn liturgies? In other words, should a part of Catholic education be at least an introduction to the solemn liturgy of the Church?
Well, that sort of picks up on what I was saying earlier about the liturgy, when it's celebrated well and solemnly and beautifully in itself, having a catechetical effect. So I think certainly part of the instruction in the classroom has to be the theology of the Eucharist, the theology of the Mass, so the people can understand the theology that the Mass is a sacrifice, that it's Christ's sacrifice made present to us on the altar, and all of that beautiful, rich theology that the Church has developed over the centuries with the Mass. But then it has to be modeled. If they're taught this theology, and then they go into the Church, and their experience in the Church is very horizontal, so to speak, and focused on the assembled believers, rather than directed toward the worship of God. It is through our worship of God that God unites us as members of the Church. Then there's going to be a disconnect there, and the students won't really come to a deep appreciation of the importance and theology of the Mass. So, make sure I answered the question.
I think you did. Specifically, to follow up on that, I asked yesterday Cardinal Burke about the extraordinary form of the Mass, which now is widely available in many parishes throughout the country. Many young people have not had any experience of the extraordinary form of the Mass in growing up, and exposure to Latin and to an understanding of that. So should it be part of the education that students are at least given an introduction to the extraordinary form of the Mass, so that they can be engaged with it and see the Mass performed in that very important way that the Church celebrates?
I do believe that it would be helpful there. I think there is a mentality out there among some that the Church began with the Vatican II. That whole hermeneutic of rupture. And I think an exposure to an appreciation of the extraordinary form of the Mass will help to claim a more of what Pope Benedict calls the hermeneutic of reform and continuity. That they can see the current form of the Mass in continuity with the form that came before the Council and how that has been developed all through the centuries. So would, I think, help to heal a rift. It would also give people a sense of connection with those who have gone before them in faith, all the way back to antiquity. I've used this line before, that when I celebrate the extraordinary form, it's like I can feel the Church breathing through the ages. Mm-hmm. So much in there has, been developing over these centuries. And we certainly know the draw that the extraordinary form and more traditional forms of worship have in general among young people. So I think they do respond positively when it's presented in a positive way. At the same time, I would point out we have kind of this, complex situation in the Church, because there are also movements in the Church that are not so traditionally oriented in their worship, but yet are very faithful to the teachings of the Church, including the moral teachings of the Church. So think about the Neo-Catechumenate Way, for example. Think about the charismatic renewal. Very different style of worship from the more reverent traditional form, yet my experience with people involved in these movements is they're very faithful to the Church. So we need to find a way that can bring about a heightened sense of communion. Now that we have a diversity of styles of worship, really, and two forms of worship and different sort of styles, to bring us together with the sense of communion and complementarity, because something will connect with some people that other things might not. So I would endorse a teaching and exposure of young people to the more traditional forms of worship of the Church, but not to the detriment of other movements, which need to be kept with a sense of communion. There's always this tendency with any movement in the Church that it kind of become an exclusive thing. We need to be careful with that. But I think there's a way we can bring these different movements of the Church, keep them close into a communion with the Church, and I see it as part of gifts God is giving us to be able to evangelize the culture that we're living in right now.
Okay. So there's engagement with the forms of the Mass and with the liturgies of the Church, but there's also understanding, and very often even those who are weekly or even daily engaged with the ordinary or extraordinary form of the Mass don't necessarily have a good understanding of the nature of grace, of the history of the sacraments, of the tradition of the Church, and where all this comes from. So would you believe that also should typically be incorporated somehow into the curriculum of Catholic schools? Should young people be formed in understanding the liturgy as well as participating in it?
Oh yes, definitely. As I was mentioning a moment ago, it has to be taught in the classroom, the theology of the liturgy, but it also has to be modeled in the Church. Engagement is perhaps a more useful term than what has become the full active conscious participation, because I think that is sometimes misunderstood to mean everybody must be doing something or having some kind of special role in the Mass, where engagement is it's the mind and the heart. And in some ways, perhaps before the council, people, in some cases anyway, were perhaps more engaged in the Mass, because by here in the church, they had more of a recognition of the sacredness of the Eucharist, for example, and what was going on, than sometimes people today, even though they might be singing songs and having some kind of an active role, but they might have not as much of awareness of what is really happening at Mass. So engagement is at every level.
Right. Okay, very good.